This is a Rogue Media Network podcast. The Waco History Podcast is sponsored by Brotherwell Brewery on historic Bridge Street in Waco.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos and Waco, I'm safe when I reach.
Welcome back to the Waco History Podcast. Great rave reviews for Policing Waco Part 1. And so we doubled Ryan Holt's appearance fee. And he has come back to be with us for Policing Waco Part 2.
And what exactly is your feedback mechanism on those reviews?
There's analytics behind it. Rick, I can't explain it to you. But anyway, this is the Waco History Podcast. Rick Tullis, that other voice you're hearing on my left is out of your other speaker, is Rick Tullis, who's back with me as guest host on the Waco History Podcast. Welcome back, Rick.
Thanks. I'm so glad to be back, and very gracious of you to allow me on again.
So Ryan was too interesting a guest to just spend a little bit of time with.
Was it interesting or long-winded?
Actually interesting.
Okay, all right,
It
good.
cuts both ways, but he was interesting. And former chief of police, current assistant city manager, and I will put the label on him as historian.
Yeah,
Very
absolutely.
interested in, done great research into the history of the police department and other city services. He may end up on other podcasts talking about the fire department and other things. But he's here today because there's after he showed us the exhibit that they have there at the police department, there's so much history that's extremely interesting. And Ryan, welcome back.
Thanks.
With us. Yeah.
Thanks, I think.
So, Rick, I know you've done some research. I have not done my research today. I'm just kind of trying to survive here. But Ryan has some things in front of him here, and I think there may be some stuff that he wants to start with.
Yeah, let's just
over there.
let's pick up kind of where we left off, Ryan.
Sure.
And we'll cede the floor to you.
Well, Stephen had stumped me during the last conversation, and he had asked me, I'd mentioned the wards, and he said, "Oh yeah, well, what were the boundaries of those wards?" And I sort of played it off like like I knew, and I knew I had read it, and so I went back and found the original handwritten council notes from 1857, and the unfortunately the descriptions are not a lot of help. Other than it says Ward 1 commencing at the river and running Main Street to 3rd Street, then 3rd Street south. Now, we don't know if that is Waco South or real south. Ward number 2 running 3rd Street north to 4th Street westward. Okay. Ward 3, and this is a street that I don't know, I haven't seen any map with a Moores Street on it, but this says running with Moores Street to 3rd Street to Webster Street to 5th Street north.
Okay.
And then the final one, Ward 4th, as they called it, running with 5th Street to Webster, then Webster to 3rd, then with 3rd Street to Moores Street, with Moores Street to the river. A.J. Moore High School used to be down there, and so I don't know if there was some area down there. That's the first time I've heard Moores Street.
What's the year on that description?
1857.
1857.
Yep.
So
January 7th, 1857, which would have made the whole town about 5 blocks by 9 blocks or so.
Right. I mean, you're all you have is 5th Street. That's as far as you go.
Yeah, that's as far out as you go. And there is a map. I think y'all have talked about it, and I've seen it. 1860 map, which would have been just 3 years later, which doesn't show it much larger. After 5th Street, the blocks are not.
They're platted
out.
They're
right.
platted, but they're not occupied.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, and there's no Moores Street that appears on this, nor Main Street. I'm assuming Main becomes Austin.
It does, yeah. It becomes Austin and Bridge Street.
Yep, on the other side.
On the other side,
Yep.
Yeah.
So anyway, I wanted to acknowledge that question that I had not provided a good answer for that originally, but there it is. And I have the handwritten council notes for that. So
it's just really interesting that the ward thing sticks in other places, but it's kind of, we don't think of Waco in that terms.
Of wards.
Yeah.
well, and in these
that dropped
in these
out of
early ones, they called them aldermen instead of councilmen or council persons. Later on, even as early as 1870, you start seeing intermixed aldermen and councilmen. So I think it was just
in looking through different accounts, it looks like the city changed its form of government 3 or 4 times.
Yep.
I mean, it wasn't. It's definitely not. Probably everything gets called differently. In the early 1900s, they're actually city commissioners. I think similar to what we would look as county commissioners now. They had districts that were, more of that form of government before it became its current form of government sometime later in the 40s or 50s, if I remember right.
Yeah, and shout out to Mayor Meek, who kind of goes through that a bit on his podcast with us.
Yeah. I forgot he joined us one time.
Yeah.
I heard it was a great podcast.
Yeah, it was.
And what were the analytics on that
we're
one?
still searching for Bradley Ford to get on the podcast, but
he's elusive.
Yeah,
I know where he works.
Well, I see some other things in front of you. Let's start with kind of 19th century, maybe some things that you discovered in looking back over your notes. And I know Rick has brought in that handbook that we've looked at many times from the 1870s. So maybe some things y'all found on the 19th century that we ought to get in here.
Yeah, I know Rick had asked sort of what it was like during the different periods of time to be a police officer, and I think we talked a little bit about it last time. That certainly in those early years, it took a certain kind of individual of a certain ilk to come out to the frontier and want to be the established law, but back then it really was here's your badge, here's your gun. They provided their own. Many of the notes I've seen said that in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, the weapon of choice was a .45 caliber revolver, and a set of brass knuckles.
Yep, I saw that
was on the list.
Yeah,
a pair of handcuffs. And essentially a stick or a sap, they called it back then. Interestingly, and we'll talk about it a little bit as we get up into the later parts, but they probably provided their own horse, because there were times later on where they had to provide their own cars. So providing their own horse, and I suspect they provided their own uniform, such as it was black. They called it sackcloth material uniform coat, and so it was pretty basic. And if you consider that they typically walked, although they did have an established mounted officer patrol as early as 1897. They said they had 6 mounted officers and 11 foot patrol officers. So they stuck with that ward system. Once the suspension bridge went in, that it included East Waco as well, and even if you're talking about from 5th Street to say Bridge or Man Street on the other side of the river, if you had to do that in a dead sprint to go to the assistance of somebody, it could wind you. So they certainly used horses even for the size of the city back then. So, but 6 mounted officers, 11 foot patrol officers at the turn of the century, that's getting to be a sizable force for a small town on the Brazos River. It looks like they stayed with that mounted theory and foot patrol theory, even once they started getting motorized. In 1911, they still had 6 mounted officers, 4 foot patrol, but they also included 1 motorized patrol wagon, or as they called it back then, the hoodlum wagon, and 1 motorbike. There's a great photograph of all of them in front of the old city hall. with the one wagon, the one motorbike, and everybody else standing there.
Yeah, I've got that I've got that picture here. And when you say motorbike too, I think it's important when you look closely of it. It's more like a bicycle with
Yes.
an engine
Yes.
attached
It's
to
a
it.
motorized bike.
It's
Yes,
not
literally a motorized
It's
bike.
not like a Harley here. It's very, very rudimentary. And then I also noticed that the wagon, the paddy wagon they had, was also doubled as the city ambulance.
Yes.
So he kind of double
Yes.
duty in that regard. And in Roger Conger's old book, The Pictorial History of Waco, there's you can kind of glean a few things out of some of his pictures that he included, which are a lot of the Gildersleeve pictures, but like there's a few pictures of them collecting poll taxes. Well, the poll taxes are being collected out of that paddy wagon or into it, and there's a police officer doing it. That was one of the police's duties was collecting taxes.
Yeah.
And there you got in this picture we're looking at here, some gentlemen standing around and a policeman right there.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of his job.
Yeah, I remember last time I talked about back then and even now, police are just the forward-facing arm of whatever government is running at the time. And so back then, the marshals or the policemen at the time were tasked with enforcing whatever was included in the charter, and sometimes the charter was different than state law, and back then, federal law, they hadn't really delineated those, lines of authority, federal versus state versus local. And so sometimes your local law did some things that was different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Right.
I've got if you want to talk about what was sort of different back then than it is now, you start going back to the age of the gangsters. So in the 1930s, and with the acknowledgement that Clyde Barrow was in jail here, but you go further back, Waco, the communication to other places was by telegraph early on in the 1900s. At the turn of the century, I've got a great picture in my office of Western Union telegraph boys with their bicycles. They would get those telegraphs, and that was early 1900s. 07, I think. But you could go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction as a bad guy, so to speak, or an outlaw, and the local police wouldn't necessarily know your history.
Right.
They'd have to.
That's when the pictures in the post office became a thing.
The old wanted posters.
Yeah.
So that was out of necessity, not just as a tool to make good Westerns. It was a necessity, a way to communicate. And so there was this delay in getting information from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, which is how you were able to develop these outlaws that could escape the long arm of the law, so to speak, because there wasn't any such thing as the National Information Computer System,
right?
NCIC and TCIC back then.
Right.
That didn't come on to much later. And so, telegraph would have been a huge thing back in those days.
Couple thoughts. One going back to the pictures you described, or the pictures we're looking at here that show a group of police officers that it's actually over 30 years. 1890, there's a group. 1900, and then somewhere around
1895.
So it's interesting, the change in uniform over time.
Yep.
Like one group is kind of wearing
cowboy hats,
and they have badges, but it looks like there's some similarity in how they're dressed. But then you get to these guys in 1895, and they're all wearing the hat, the bobby hat.
Yep, the bobby hat.
Yeah,
Keystone.
Keystone cop
and in
hat.
a couple of those, the ones I've seen a little bit after the turn of the century, there's actually some gentlemen with a sort of it looks like a square conductor's hat that says turnkey on it. And those were the jailers. Because a lot of these photos are outside of the old city hall where they were taken. And if you look closely at the early photographs, 1890s, and there were some a little bit before that, if you really look at the high definition ones, you can go online at the Texas collection and zoom way in. You can see they're wearing old school gun belts, like from the Western. They've got these dress coats on, but they're still slinging, a 6-shooter and an old school gun belt because, back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, or when all the shootings, the duels were occurring right out here. Chick McLennan, who was the grandson of Neil McLennan, was murdered right out here in the square in 1891. And then, of course, you have the Brand related shootings in 1897 and 1898. So there was that. Right. This was still literally the Wild West at the turn of the century.
Yeah. So I'll jump over to another thing I came across in the old 1913 handbook. Mm-hmm. And, they make a few statements in here about the police department. Maybe I'll read those in a minute. But one of the more interesting parts was the health department has a report in here about cause of death. And they list, old age, tuberculosis, meningitis. They're listing all these other things. I kind of get to the end of it, and it lists external causes. So gunshot. Mm-hmm. So in 1913, 11 people died of gunshot. In 1912, it was 14. 1911, 10. So, they're double digits every year. And then you go down a little bit further, they've got knife wounds. Well, 5 people died of knife wounds, fractured skulls, 4 of those, poisoning 7, strangulation 1.
I'm glad you're getting a kick out of this.
Yeah. Well,
wow.
It's too soon.
And I guess to make your point, how many, I think I quickly looked up, maybe it was in 2021, mm-hmm. There may have been, was there 14 murders in Waco? Yeah. And 10 of those may have been by gunshot.
Right.
Something along those lines.
Right.
So they had 40,000 people in all of Waco then.
Yeah.
Versus our population now, which is
140-ish.
140-ish.
Yeah.
And the rate of crime was the same.
Well, and a lot of those happen right out here in broad daylight over a disagreement.
Yeah.
Whereas today, most of our homicides are family violence related, interpersonal conflict within a household type of thing. Back then, it was you disrespected me. Let's stand out here
premeditated
and go at it.
Yeah. Anyway, it's when you think of the numbers here, it's pretty stark difference in the world we live in today.
Yep.
So
absolutely.
Okay, something else when you were talking about early policing, mm-hmm. I don't remember the exact year. I saw some reference to call boxes.
Oh yeah, mm-hmm. yeah. So sort of along those same lines as the telegraph, the police officers, as they went out into the field, they had to have some way to communicate back to headquarters, so to speak, without running the several blocks back to it. And so sometime around in the 20s is what I've read, is that they established these call boxes around town. And it was not just specific to Waco. Most jurisdictions had these call boxes, both mm-hmm. police and fire call boxes, with essentially an early telephone line back to headquarters, so to speak. And those stayed in use until the 1930s. Some two-way radios started coming in. In 1933, there was a one-way radio in 8 cars and 6 motorcycles that PD had, but they had these. The only two-way conversation was either you go all the way back to City Hall or you go to one of these blue call boxes, and there are photos of them around. Gildersleeve has some photos of some officers using the old school call boxes. But it was that method. How do you talk back to headquarters, so to speak? Right. And they would call in at certain times of the day.
Yeah, it seems like it was like every 30 minutes is what I read, that they were expected to report in.
Yep. Yeah. And they would get their calls for service that they would then go do. Waco, because Waco had telephone service pretty early on. I remember, I've got it here somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, in the 1880s, as early as that. In fact, Steven's waiting for me to come out with a awesome podcast on infrastructure things like gas and electricity and telephone.
Telephone
It'll be
arrived in
riveting.
Waco in
It'll be riveting.
1881, and by the time they converted, they didn't convert to a dial telephone system until 1949. So they had the old school. They had 500 operators at its height, downtown Waco, Texas.
Right.
And you picked up the phone and you said, "Hey, Ethel, I want to talk to Stephen," and they would connect you until 1949.
Yeah. See Andy Griffith.
Yeah. And so
often on a party line.
the same thing, police. If you need the police, hey, Beatrice, can you connect me to the police station?
Yeah, give me Andy.
And there's some great photos in some of these books of the dispatch system that was in the old city hall. And so they had one of those lines, and then there was a line to each of the call boxes. And so that's how the police officers talked until about the early 30s. Then they had one-way radios. And so when I'm told by some of the old timers that they knew they would get a call because their horn would honk. They were getting a call from City Hall in their car. Now they couldn't respond; they could just hear the call.
Actually, I remember that as a kid. A lot of the farmers had up in the Panhandle. They had those same systems, and so their truck would start honking, and we'd be like, "Oh, they're getting a phone call! How cool is that?"
So for about 4 years there in the 30s, they had one-way radios, and then in 37 in Waco, they got two-way radios. 6 cars and about 30 officers. Now that was in the Great Depression, that somehow the city was able to get the resources to get two-way radios. So it was pretty important that was also during the time where the officers used their own cars. The city paid for gas. Their salary was $103 a month. But you had to use your own car. The city paid for gas, and there's a few articles talking about the police department putting together a soup kitchen in the Great Depression. That was one of their things, as to serve the community, was to run a soup kitchen in 1936.
Wow. Okay, so I know we're jumping around time frames here quite a bit, but let's go back to 1913.
All right,
because I got
you have some excerpts there.
I got the book. So some of the things we've hit on, but so this 1913 municipal handbook, it was basically, if you went out to the internet today to look up what city of Waco, it would give you all this glowing information about Waco. No offense, but it's kind of the same thing here in the handbook. So here's the write-up about the police department. The department has been changed from a small department of 17 or 18 men without any equipment and brought up to the most efficient metropolitan department, officered now by a chief, an assistant chief, a day and night sergeants, 4 detectives, and 28 men in the ranks, and an up-to-date police flashlight system installed throughout the city. I'm sure that's some kind of call box thing right there. And equipped with a combination patrol wagon and ambulance. The increase in the department has been justified by the fact that it has made a vast reduction in the insurance key rate, and no other city in Texas can truthfully boast of a more efficient police department than Waco's.
Well, they used to be fire watch also. They had fire whistles.
Yeah.
And I think y'all have talked about the key maps that we used to put out was dealing with insurance rates.
Yeah.
And so there you go. Apparently the police department was part of the early ISO rating.
Part of that.
That the city of Waco now has an ISO 1 rating, by the way.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, just because we're here, you can say it.
It has stayed top of the line.
Okay, so here was something interesting. Can you tell me what a police matron is? So the commissioner as a unit recently went on record as favoring the appointment of a police matron. At the time, the city hall did not contain quarters that could be used for this purpose, but in the changes now being made, this will be provided for.
Yeah, so in the early days, police matrons were female officers brought on, but they had limited duties dealing with children who had been victims of crime and sort of administrative tasks.
Okay.
It wasn't until the 70s that the first female officers who didn't have restricted duties would be put into the force as regular officers.
Gotcha. Okay, good context. This is back to you mentioned these newsboys a minute ago.
Yep.
Next paragraph. A departure from the regular order of things has occurred in Waco, and that Mr. R.L. Flowers, a man thoroughly equipped by training and temperament, receiving an appointment from our police force and was assigned to the special duty of looking after the boys of the streets of Waco, the little fellows who must earn their livelihood and in some instances must contribute to the support of mother. This man is a big brother to them, taking their part when imposed upon, correcting them when wrong, and influencing them to higher ideals, which in the end will make them better men.
Yeah.
There you go.
So
community policing.
You had the hoodlums, so to speak, the kids running around, the ne'er-do-wells, the Utes of Waco, trying to needed to be influenced and corralled during the day.
Yeah. So then also in 1913, they've got their budget in here. So this is interesting. What's your budget now? But roughly for the police force,
$48 million.
$48 million, and all we have are 10, or whatever, 14 homicides a year,
right?
And your dollar per homicide is pretty high. So their budget was $42,000. So a much more economical choice. So
let's try not to get political here.
And so I looked at how that broke down, because they have a breakdown in here of their $42,000. Some of the stuff in here, repairs, lights, stationery, postage, feeding prisoners, $2,086.
Oh, wow.
Dog catching, $322. Speaking of other duties that
as assigned.
Yeah. Total payroll for, what did we just read? 28 officers, something like that.
Yeah.
It was $35,000.
Yeah.
But they also collected money, right? I mean, there's fines, and it's part of what they do. So in that year, the chief of police collected fines and impound fees totaling $12,790. So, they're paying for themselves.
That was in 1913.
One of the things that I'm looking at in this book by Conger is he's describing early Waco policemen carried a .45 revolver, brass knuckle, and a dirk knife, and a pair of handcuffs we talked about earlier. But it also talks about Waco policemen directing chain gangs of prisoners on road building projects in the early 1900s. And, of course, there's a lot of that going on in the early 1900s when they're finally paving the city in a lot of respects. But that the confining chain went around the prisoner's ankle and fastened to a belt at his waist. And when the prisoners were kept overnight on a work project, a policeman drove a heavy iron pin through one end of the chain and into the ground, thus securing the prisoners for the night.
Yikes.
Gosh. But labor being provided by prisoners, and another duty the policemen are serving.
Which was pretty common across the country at the time of using that as a labor force. Obviously, as time went on and into the probably the mid 1900s, that became frowned upon, and really a departure there based on Supreme Court cases and what's acceptable confinement, particularly in Texas. Judge William Wayne Justice, a federal judge, intervened out of Tyler in the Texas prison system, and so you saw a significant change mid 1900s into the late 1900s in how prisoners were kept, and for the better, obviously. So
right, nobody talks about. Well, I mean, maybe they do. Hard Time, right? I mean, Hard Time was out on a chain gang somewhere.
Literally busting rocks.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So keep marching us through time as technology evolved, and eventually we're gonna intersect where you entered the force. And so it's gonna get really personal.
We're not quite there yet.
It's gonna get personal.
Yeah, I mean, you had some other influences going on in policing. In the early 1900s or in the 1930s, we talked about the Great Depression. You had Prohibition, obviously influencing policing. I think at the museum, y'all saw the Thompson machine gun that the city of Waco got from the U.S. Treasury Service. Originally, they had 3 of those. One is in a museum. One is in a museum in Florida, and one is a museum here at the police tower. And one's gone missing through the years. It's reported stolen. So
Is that your house?
Well, no, certainly not my house.
Okay, all right.
We will.
That's
we
just
will
a
track
rumor.
that
That's
down.
just a rumor.
This is your chance
Yeah,
if you're
sorry.
within the sound of our voice
Yes.
to bring it
That's
back.
right. Bring it
Yeah.
back. No questions
Just
asked.
leave it on the porch at the police.
Having
headquarters.
shot one of those, that's quite the full auto 45 caliber.
It's a big round.
It's
Yeah.
you've been shooting something when you shoot that
Absolutely.
thing. So, but and it's the same conversation that's going on now in policing as to how should your local police be armed or defensively capable. It's what are the bad guys carrying?
Mm-hmm.
And so the same thing was going on there.
Yeah, I noticed some conversations as I was looking into kind of the history of policing of even when you talk about uniforms, and I know this is a little controversial now, how it when they began to standardize uniforms, or they became more, it was really they were copying military uniforms,
Right.
and now we get to today where military uniforms, which may at one point been more ceremonial, I mean now they're very tactical, they're very practical to being on part of a fighting force, but still, those some of those elements carry over into policing as well, and there's been some pushback on that.
Yeah, I think from a uniform perspective, from a police department, there are a number of laws that require the person committing the offense to have known it was a police officer that was either trying to stop them, and so you have the need for a uniform there. As far as some of the bleed over from military uniforms to police uniforms, it's usually about comfort and ability to function in some of the more difficult situations. Obviously, SWAT incidents. A regular wool uniform or a regular polyester uniform melts very, very easily when exposed to fire, and some of those things. And so you want to protect your officers. There really is protective equipment, the type of uniform they're wearing now. But some of that comes from, we were talking about the influences on police work. And so as you come out of the 30s, you've got the Great Depression. In the 40s with the civilian, during the beginning of World War II, there was a need to have 24-hour patrol. And so that's when you see Waco Police implement 24-hour patrol. And it wasn't just about crime suppression as much as it was about defense of the country in the early 40s. And so World War II really influences policing a lot. They implemented two-way radios in all their vehicles. The city, we implemented a civil service in Waco, Texas, which is really that departure from the spoils system of who are the police officers and who are the police chiefs. You see a lot of technology coming online in 1949. Waco converted from that to a dial telephone system like we talked about.
Right. Well, and I can think about this at the end of World War II, how many hundreds of thousands of men had been trained as MPs.
Yeah, absolutely.
That were coming back from the war and looking for jobs. So it was, probably the first consistent training across a mass group of people that had been undertaken in the U.S.
Well, and think about the subdivisions, that are expanding the population growth.
Right.
You're starting to see the need for more officers. They quit using the motorcycles in 1958. They totally did away with motorcycles, but there for a while between the 40s and the 50s, I think I saw a photograph with as many as 15 motorcycles. They were just trying to cover the area, the expanding jurisdictional area that they were having to cover at the time, and so then you get into the 1950s, coming out of that immediate post-war expansion. You get into the 50s. You have the 1953 tornado.
Right.
Lots of photographs and stories about Waco police and Waco Fire assisting with that. Ultimately, they brought in the National Guard to help because there were looters around downtown after the tornado, unfortunately. And so in the grand scheme, you're still talking about, not a lot of officers. And so fortunately, we had the National Guard, a good relationship with the National Guard here in Waco, and they came in. But then you see that technology again that was developed during World War II and shows up in Waco in the form of radar. So Waco PD gets their first radar units in the 60s.
Oh, wow.
And begins doing traffic enforcement. If you think about the old school hot rods.
And 2 months later, the first radar detector came out.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And so radar was acquired in the 60s. Polygraphs were acquired in the 60s. Then if you talk about influencing on police work, in 1966, you had the University of Texas Tower shooting where Charles Whitman killed 17 folks. And you start seeing a conversation about the need for police to be able to respond to that sort of event. During that event, the radio stations called on civilians to bring their deer rifles into downtown
Little 38
Austin.
pistols, not going to make it up.
Not going to make it.
10 stories up.
That's what police carried at the time, 38 pistols, 45 pistols, and 12-gauge shotguns. And those 12-gauge shotguns came out of the military from World War II, those trench guns and the old 12-gauge 870, Remington 870s. And so you start seeing a conversation about the need for SWAT. It doesn't take a foothold yet, but there's a conversation about that. I actually got to meet Ramiro Martinez, who was the Austin officer who went to the top and was able to stop that.
Yeah, if I remember
shooting.
right, they found a back way in to
They went to the top.
upper floor.
Him and a couple of
surprised him.
civilians, McCoy and Crum. And Martinez ended up living here later in life and became friends with some of the detectives at Waco PD. And so I had an opportunity to meet with him a little bit and talk to him. But that was a dramatic shift in police thinking. Later on in 1966, Waco PD started a police cadet system, meaning that when kids would come out of high school, they would allow them to work in the police department, keep them close to that until they could get old enough. Back then you could become a police officer as long as you turned 21 once you were out.
Right. And it wasn't in the 60s that, I don't know the exact name of the code, but the Uniform Police Officer Code came out at the state level.
At the state level, yeah.
Yeah. What's the name of that?
It's called TCOL, Texas Commission on Law Enforcement Education.
Yeah.
It was something different back then. But you got about 14 weeks of education by then under that uniform code, which was pretty significant given before that.
There was
pretty much, you were with a senior officer and put out on the street. And so interesting, back then in the 60s, late 60s through about 73, Waco had a boat patrol. Later on, I've actually worked boat patrol, not ones that Waco PD had, but we would work with the Corps of Engineers and the Texas Parks and Wildlife Game Wardens on Lake Waco and Lake Brazos. So, but Waco had its own boat patrol back in the late 60s, early 70s. We talked about the first female officers, unrestricted female officers in the late 60s. And there was a lot of things going on about this time, the Vietnam War, a lot of political influence, anti-government. They started issuing handheld radios to recruits in 1972. And then in 1974, you had the Symbionese Liberation Army shootout in LA, where there were about 9,000 rounds exchanged between the SLA and the Los Angeles Police Department.
Okay.
And that combined with the UT Tower shooting, really was the impetus for early SWAT teams. Yeah. And the recognition that there are some things that are beyond the scope of regular patrol officers. And so Waco formed its first SWAT team about that time. In 1976, this is the first photograph I found of the Waco SWAT team. And it was 6 officers. And when you look back, and I've actually worked with a couple of those folks that were still around when I started, and they were just tough dudes. And there weren't, today there's a lot of really developed tactics that goes into that. But back then it was
it mainly just, hey, you've got some heavier equipment, maybe some body armor that the other guys don't have.
Well, and you have to remember back then body armor was just coming around. And so even the body armor that was introduced into patrol was to stop handgun rounds.
Right. The old flak jackets from Vietnam kind of stuff.
So to stop rifle rounds back then, you were talking about steel plates. And so that was really heavy.
Oh yeah.
To carry around. And so it was, it was, you had to know what you were doing and to be able to operate in that, with that kind of weight back then. They got their first drug sniffing dog in the late 70s. They had introduced bullet resistant vests in patrol, and the actual first save of a police officer by a vest was Randy Alleman was saved by the vest he was wearing on September 29th of 1978. They did not have mandatory wear at the time.
Okay.
Actually, mandatory wear didn't come in till the 90s.
Oh my goodness.
So there for more than a decade, a little decade and a half, nearly 2 decades, they would provide the vest, but it wasn't mandatory because Texas was hot. Texas is hot.
It still is.
And those vests, as it turns out, those vests were like, when you put them on, it was like wearing saran wrap. And so just really uncomfortable, but you had to make a choice. Frank Ganch, who's one of the assistant chiefs, y'all got to meet him at the museum. He was shot in the line of duty down here at the bus station. He was not wearing his vest at the time. It wasn't mandatory wear. And we nearly lost him because of that. But later on, those vests become much more wearable. They're still hot. Even the ones today with all the technology, they're much, much lighter. I mean, even from the time I started to the ones they're issuing now, they're much better.
Right.
But still, when you put that on and you go out and you work on the interstate and it's 112 degrees, it is, you're wearing it, and it's
it's hard to make it breathable. I mean,
absolutely.
So what were the circumstances with the Alleman?
Alleman, he had stopped somebody at the bus station also.
Okay.
And so
this is the old downtown bus station.
At 8th and Columbus right there. We had a sergeant stabbed there and killed, who's one of the officers killed in the line of duty. Frank Assistant Chief Ganch was shot in the alley there. Not a good place to be around. Bad karma.
You don't want to pull that duty.
That's right. Bad karma. So the 70s, a lot of stuff going on in the 70s, just like in the country, Waco reflected that. But in 1978, they had 164 officers.
Wow.
Technology, coming out of the war. And then in the 80s, you start seeing a little bit of a turn in tactics, and Crime Stoppers comes out in the early 1980s.
One technology piece that I think came out of the Vietnam War that we saw in the museum was night vision.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you had an example
very
of that.
Early, very, very
that
early.
was the size of this table we're sitting at. Yeah.
Absolutely. And policing, because they are a quasi-military organization, structured organization, and they find themselves in the same kind of situations. Unfortunately, sometimes sometimes the military, the equipment that originates in military situations can play a positive role in a law enforcement standpoint when things have gone bad. Because when you're getting shot at, you don't care what caliber it is. You're trying to get it stopped and
right.
Move down the road.
And unfortunately, the bad guys don't follow any rules there when it comes to what weapons they can use or not use against the police. Yeah,
absolutely. So you have Crime Stoppers in the 80s that, you start seeing this conversation about the community being the eyes and ears of law enforcement, and recognizing that police can't arrest their way out of crime. And so you really are relying on really start relying on the community. And so you see that, and our Crime Stoppers program since the 80s still goes strong today, award-winning every year. They have tremendous results of arresting folks that have outstanding, generally outstanding felony warrants. And so in the early 80s, and then you start seeing some issues that, good and bad. The bad is that in 1985, General Tire closed here. But I know of several officers that had worked at General Tire, and when General Tire closed, they turned trying to find something that would be here longer. And so Waco PD got some officers out of the General Tire closing. But that was 1,400 employees that the Waco economy lost. But the city of Waco got to pick up some of those. In 1985, the first mainframe computer comes into play at Waco PD at the cost of $352,000. Interesting.
And how would have been used at that point? I mean, obviously you didn't have the connectivity into cars like you do now, so it was.
Yeah, but you would have had connectivity to the state by the 80s.
Okay,
and so that would have been your main connection to the state and to the national computer.
Right.
Keeping records of all your cases,
data, a lot of database.
Instead of handwritten, it would have been data from those cases so that you could search those quickly.
So you're sitting down in front of a green screen and typing in all your reports.
Yeah, they were called VT100 terminals. They weren't even called computer screens; they were terminals.
Sure, terminal.
And green and gold, kind of situation. Interestingly, while I was chief, a gentleman sent in a open records request and wanted to know where what was the end result of that mainframe computer and the $352,000. He had been involved in something going on at the time, and he wanted to know what was the result of that. I helped take that mainframe computer out of the police department in 1996.
Okay.
So they used it for about a decade.
Wow.
That's before they converted to what we would consider a PC-based server in 1996. And I helped move that old system out.
That's a long time in computer years. Yeah.
It was
this gentleman wants accountability.
It was taken out, and I'm sure it went to auction as state law requires.
Right.
But they used it for more than a decade. And interestingly, Waco PD was involved in a project with Baylor in the early 90s in predictive policing. One of the very first of those kind of projects around the country in predictive policing. I remember being in patrol, and we'd get a report that would say, on this Friday night, you would expect this number of car burglaries in this area.
Right.
So you would do some deployment based on that.
Yeah.
And you hear a little bit about predictive policing nowadays.
AI is totally.
And so there were. I remember there were a couple of interns from Baylor and some other folks that were housed at the police department at the time in the 90s and doing predictive policing. So very way before the curve.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Having them here. So interestingly, in 87, the average monthly salary of a beginning police officer was $24,000. That was in 87. And then 89, I think we talked a little bit about the world before 911.
Yeah.
Before 911, people had to go, obviously it was a landline. Mm-hmm. They went and they would call the main number. And then in 1987, there was a referendum, and in 1989 was December 16, 1989 was the first 911 call in Waco, Texas. Mm-hmm. And so 911 creates an urgency to a call. And so now there's this expectation when you dial 911 and you ask for a police officer that you're going to get a police officer, a uniformed officer. And so there are some expectations that have to be managed there. But ever since that, 911 has only grown. Waco PD is still the largest public safety answering point for the county. There are others.
How's it structured? Is it one call center for the whole county, or does it get routed based upon where the call originates from?
The call is routed in using the technology that's out there now. The 911 district is a quasi-governmental entity of its own,
Yeah.
and it's funded through fees from your landline and cellular telephone bills, and they fund the switching equipment at these public safety answering points, and the main one is at the Waco Police Tower, and they answer calls for anybody in the city limits of Waco. Anybody in unincorporated areas of the county also goes there. And then there are some of the other cities, Woodway, Hewitt, Robinson, Belmead, Lacey, Lakeview, all have their own answering points. So if you're inside those city limits and you dial 911, it goes to the appropriate call. If it happens to end up in the wrong PSAP, they can switch it between to the appropriate public safety answering point very quickly.
Right.
So,
but as we talked about, I mean, that's a sea change. I mean, that's a dramatic change for policing.
Yeah,
Can you talk a little bit more? Yeah, how that
two things really change response for police. One is the 911 calls. If you talk to the officers who were around before 911, they said it was a much slower, just an environment. People would call, you would go, and there would be this interaction. Whereas 911 means now there's always a list of 911 calls to respond to. And then when the cell phones came along in the mid 90s, everything now is an in progress call.
Yeah.
And so before, somebody would see a wreck, well, then they've got to go find a payphone or they've got to go to a business or whatever. Well, now they're calling in right then while they see it, and usually multiple callers. And so it's everything is in progress. And so now you have whole sections of the department, generally patrol division, that all they do are answer 911 calls, and they go call to call to call to call all day and all night. The city of Waco PD answers over 100,000 911 calls a year.
Wow, that's amazing.
And there are a number of those that they don't answer. So if the call comes in and it's not something that's criminal or that an officer needs to respond to, then that call is routed somewhere else. So the main switchboard at the city of Waco or at the police tower, they take about 500,000 phone calls a year for the police department. And then about 100,000 of those go out and require officer response in the field. And so it's just, if you talk to those officers who were on the street before and the officers now, and it also lent itself to, you've heard people talk about, or you've probably heard people talk about, when they introduced the car and it pulled the officers off the street, they quit walking the beats, they put them in a car, they rolled up their windows, they got air conditioning. There was this disconnection from the citizens, right? It's the air conditioner.
Yeah.
But the reality is that was going to happen anyway with the advent of 911 and the cell phone, because you no longer could have enough officers to cover, a walking beat and respond to 911 calls. Through the years, Waco has had bicycle officers. And when I came out in the 90s, we had some neighborhood officers on bikes, and they were extremely effective. We had two groups of about 6 officers and a sergeant, and they would work some of the housing complexes in town, and they were tremendously effective. But the reality, and I saw it firsthand, because when we came out of the academy, we had to go ride a bicycle with those teams, and we would literally get a call. We would be in downtown and get a call in South Waco on a bicycle.
Yeah.
And so here we would go.
And you didn't have any bike lanes back then.
Yeah, no bike lanes. They did a tremendous job. And we would get south of Baylor and go answer a call.
Wow.
And then you'd get another call at 18th and Austin. And so here you go.
Now I know the cities had mounted folks, but were those Parks and Rec guys, or were those actually officers?
Yeah, Cameron Park.
Okay.
Yeah. Y'all have a good podcast talking about.
Yeah, Larry Sims, who's a longtime ranger,
former Waco police officer.
Yes,
Larry went over to the tremendous guy.
Yeah,
went over and was one of the mounted officers in the park. And he does a good job of talking about, I believe the late 70s, talking about some of the traffic issues down in Cameron Park, related to they were able to do a much better job in those situations, because when you introduce a police officer, sometimes it creates this tension, and those park rangers were able to go in and just have a much better success rate in getting cooperation from people sometimes than police officers are, because it's a different interaction.
Sure.
But I tell you what, I was one of those officers that Larry was talking about. When they called for help, we came running, because we knew that when those park rangers called for help, they had tried everything they had at their disposal,
Right.
because they didn't call PD just to call them. And so when they called, we knew to get there in a hurry. And Larry and his group, they were always right. And so they did a tremendous job down in the park. So yeah, the 911 and cell phones really changed, and it took an intentional paradigm shift in the 90s to go to pull officers out that all they would do is go interact with the community.
This is community policing.
Community policing in the 90s. I think I talked in the last one about Gil Miller from Austin. He was the chief brought in from Austin, and he really helped bring that old school, what is now old school, community policing. And what you have to do is you really have to take officers, and it's extremely expensive.
Yeah.
Because you have to take officers that they don't run call to call to call.
It's not efficient.
It's not efficient. It's extremely laborious, cost a lot of money.
I found out in business that people are not efficient.
It's your most expensive thing, right?
Dealing with relationships and people and all the interactions that come with either customers or employees, or in your case, the public.
Yeah.
There's no way to make that efficient.
But what we found out is that that relationship with the community is priceless.
Yeah.
And so it's taken us a while to be able to convince the taxpayers, because ultimately that's who we're responsible to, are the taxpayers, is that in order to have that kind of relationship between the community and the police that everybody wants,
you got to invest
the police have to have some kind of time to do that. They cannot be going call to call to call. And Waco PD still answers 100,000 calls for service a year, but now they've been given some tools, some officers that get to concentrate on the community and on the neighborhoods. You have to have that in order to achieve that. And communities who have reinvested are doing well, and communities who have not reinvested, you can look across the country. If they haven't reinvested in that kind of policing, they're facing some challenges, because it's about creating trust. Chief Victorian talks about she wants officers creating trust in every interaction, and they're doing that. They're out there doing that. And you can say that as a patrol officer, but when you know you've got 13 calls holding that you need to answer, you just can't spend as much time as you need to develop relationships. Now, I've worked both systems as a patrol officer. I've worked the call to call system, and I've also worked the community system. I had the opportunity to run the Citizens on Patrol program early in my career, and the Citizens Police Academy program. And you just have to have the time to develop the relationships to create the trust, and it's worth every penny. Now, there's a breakover point, and you got to figure that out, and how much will the community pay for, but it pays dividends, real dividends.
Right.
We in Waco are lucky. We have this ongoing relationship with the community, and there's been some hard times, but we've always made it through because of that relationship. So
yeah, and it also seems like you're investing that into subsets of the community that may have lower trust of the police force.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we talked a little bit about that last time, but Waco is a bunch of communities who all happen to live in the same geographic location, and everybody comes with their own history and their own perception of what police mean in their family, not only their family, but their culture, their race. It means something different to every person, that badge and that uniform.
Right.
And so we've tried through the last few decades to educate police officers on that too, that your history is not the person's history that you're dealing with. And you don't get to stop and say, okay, everybody stop shooting at each other and tell me your history first.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to go in and sort that out, and knowing that everybody comes with a different history and is going to look at you differently. And so a lot of times police officers have to go in and make order out of chaos.
Yeah.
And knowing that you mean something different to each person in the interaction. And so it's extremely challenging, but man, we've got a bunch of good police officers that are doing it now. So,
and also challenged by perceptions that are shaped by things that happen a long way from Waco, as we can see in
much
recent
more
years.
global community that we are now. So when people see a uniform in another state, they see the police.
Yeah.
They don't know that was a state trooper or a sheriff's deputy or a whatever in some other organization. And the reality is that different states get different amounts of training, and even in Texas, some jurisdictions, if you pay $15 an hour versus $49 an hour, then you're going to get potentially different skill levels there, and the amount of training that's poured into the officers in different jurisdictions. And so the police, what does that mean? The police. Well, it literally means different things in different communities. And so those things matter. And now, our police have a much better understanding of mental health and all those things, but there are still plenty of jurisdictions around that's not as important. And in the history of policing, skin color didn't mean as much as it should. And, those sorts of things have fortunately developed through the years, but there are always opportunities to better the profession. And it's a constant that has to be addressed, all the time. And we're doing a better job at it now than we ever have. And if you look at there's something like 400,000 citizen contacts with police a day in this country. And so if you look at the sheer numbers of those that go wrong, it's a pretty small percentage, but even one is too many. And so you have to keep that in mind as, about those interactions and the sheer volume. And just in Waco, you have at least 100,000 police citizen contacts a year. And so when I say you've got good men and women working for Waco PD, they're just doing a tremendous job at it. Do police officers make mistakes? Absolutely.
So I got a couple of technology things to go back to, if you don't mind, because we talked about laptop computers in police vehicles.
Yep. 1995.
Life before that. What did you do, and how did you manage all your information before you had the computer, and then what it looked like after?
So at least at Waco PD, the standard was you went to roll call. So roll call is about a 15-minute meeting at the beginning of every shift where the sergeants impart their wisdom on you and tell you what's going on in the world. And
the Hill Street Blues opening scene.
It's exactly like that. And back in the day,
that's an old show.
I remember that.
We would take what we called the hot sheet, which was a list of all the stolen vehicles. It would be on the front, and you'd take that hot sheet and you'd put it on your clipboard. And so when dispatch would call your number on the radio, you pull to the side, and whatever they would give you the next call for service, and you would write it down so that you remembered what address and all the stuff. You would very quickly write it down, and then you'd go to your call. And then after you got through with that call, you'd put it on your activity sheet. Well, in 1995, Waco PD was one of the first police organizations in Texas to have in-car computers or real laptops in the computers. Austin PD beat us because they had some of those old monochrome terminals in their cars. But Waco PD used a very early cellular system called CDPD technology. It was like 19.2 baud, very slow. But it was miraculous. You turn on your computer and dispatch would send you your call. Now, we didn't trust the computers, and so we still put the call out over the radio.
Right.
But you didn't have to stop and write it down anymore. Now you could look at the call and go to the call. And so it sped up your response time inordinately by just not having to pull over and write down the call. You could run individuals on the computer again. A lot of officers didn't because they didn't trust it. And they'd still run people over the radio. But then after a couple of years, there was a joke that officers would drive a car without oil, but they wouldn't drive it without a computer. Once they had made that transition, to depending on those computers, they were all in on the computers.
Right.
And today are the grandchildren, computers are now still in the cars and running very similar systems where they can do just about everything in those cars from their computers.
So you talked about pre-computer. You kind of kept a library of information with you in your car.
Yeah, Polaroid photographs of the folks in your beat who you knew committed a lot of crime. Polaroid was your best friend back then. I remember when we came out of the academy, every officer would buy their own Polaroid camera, and the department would provide the film. And so you worked crime scenes, minor crime scenes, with a Polaroid camera. If it was a serious crime scene, then the special investigators would come out with the good cameras, the Hasselblads and the Leicas and those kinds of the large format, medium format cameras. And your Polaroid was your best friend because you knew who all your car burglars were and your house burglars, and you kept photos of them and you kept information on them, and you knew. I mean, but even then, when we were answering 911 calls, we still knew our beats. And mine happened to be in South Waco, and you did develop relationships with the people living in your beat, and you knew folks back then. But the Polaroid was your best friend.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And then was there other information? I just remember you talking about keeping all these binders in your vehicle.
Yeah. I mean,
how a lot of that went away with the computer.
All the forms you needed to keep. For every law you needed.
Everything you were logging.
Yeah, all the 6 different codes. You've got Texas Penal Code and the Alcohol Code and all the different codes, and now of course you can get all that on your phone. You're like, I know it's against the law, I just don't remember which law it is, and so you got to go find it. But city ordinances, and you had to have all that with you, printed copies of all that stuff with you, and all the forms that you needed for the jail or a warrant or whatever, warrantless arrest affidavits and all that sort of stuff is now at your fingertips on the computer.
Yeah.
If you're going to give property back to somebody, you had to have, back then it was called a Form 10. If you're going to work a rec, you had to have a Form 7. And, now they do recs completely online. And so it was a different, everything was on paper at that point in time, pen and paper. And so I remember first time we got a 3D crime scene scanner in the 2000s. And, now they can put up a drone, and you have a fatality wreck. If we had a fatality wreck, we'd have to keep the interstate closed for hours and hours and hours. And now they can put up a drone and it scans the wreck scene, and then they can take that back to the we still call it the hall, that police department, and do all the measurements, electronically now. And so drone technology, in-car computers. The car technology changed. Back when I started, there were no what they called good time radios in the cars. There were no AM FM radios because those cost extra.
That's good time radio. Okay.
But probably the best police car ever made was the Caprice Classic with the big Corvette LT1 engine in it that came out in 1994.
Which I was gonna ask some questions about vehicles, because I think that people are car aficionados want to know
through the years,
what's really
Crown
under the
Vic,
hood. What's really under the hood?
Back in the day, the car manufacturers made unrestricted vehicles for police with heavier duty components in them, and so they lasted a little longer. But nowadays, there's not much difference, and they're not unrestricted motors anymore. They do still have heavier components because they put a lot of miles in. Waco streets are much better than they were, but there's still some challenges. And so those components.
I'll talk to Mayor Meek about that.
They can wear out cars pretty fast. Anytime you're and Waco drives their cars 24 hours a day. So they're in a pool system. And so they, from shift to shift to shift.
So what would you say the average mileage lifespan is of a?
In Waco, it's
cruiser.
gotten a lot better, but it's about 130,000, 140,000 miles is about the end of a police car now.
Okay.
Just the technology, so good and bad, with the more technology in a car, they're more fragile than they were.
Yeah.
That's why I say those 1994 through 1996 or 7 Caprice classics are a lot of folks' most favorite cars.
I remember that car, big, round,
looked like a big whale.
Yeah.
But it, there wasn't a place it couldn't go, off road, on road.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen police officers do some amazing things with those cars. Sometimes you'd lose an oil pan, sometimes you wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
But they, it was about getting to the call safely.
So did you ever catch air?
No, I would never have been driving fast enough to catch air. Because
that's the first thing he said. That
did you see a smile on his face when he said that?
I believed it all up until that point.
I saw a little something, a glimmer.
Well, in the mid '90s, the first VHS in-car cameras appeared in Waco, Texas, and I can remember you would start your shift, you would get a blank VHS, and you would go out to your car and you would put it in the VHS recorder in the trunk or in the glove box. And then that was your in-car camera.
Like an 8-hour, having an 8-hour runtime.
And in the property room, we used to have stacks and stacks and stacks.
I bet that'd be some awesome viewing
of
now.
VHS tapes. Yeah. And so it wasn't until, much later, the mid 2000s, when we got digital HD cameras. Back then they were a company called WatchGuard and sort of the early HD cameras, and now they're Axon. But it's all 4K. Now crisp. Multiple cameras, zooms in automatically on stuff, microphone pack that you can get blocks and blocks away from your car and it stays connected. Back then, if you bailed out of your car and you were in a foot pursuit, they were good for about a block to catch your audio. Then the audio would cut out. And so then all you're watching is the hood of your car. And then here, if you caught the suspect, then here in about 3 or 4 minutes, you'd see you walking back up the road with the person. And then as you got closer, the audio would kick back in.
Right.
And catch the scene. But it was just, you were literally looking at the hood of your car, what was happening in front of your car. And inevitably, a lot of stuff usually happens outside that purview. But it was better. It was better than nothing.
Yeah.
And much like the body cameras of today, it provides protection for the officers.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember some of those early dash cameras. There's a lot of conversation about who invented the earliest dash camera. I think the internet likes to say that the Russian police actually invented it. But one of the very first systems I ever saw was a guy named Big Jim Kaboviak. He was the district attorney in Brazos County, just to the south of us. And he had put together a system for DWIs, for DWI conviction, because even back then, if it didn't happen on video for DWI, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Right.
And so the district attorney's office in Bryan wrote a grant and put these systems together and gave them to law enforcement in Brazos County. And he was one of the first prosecutors to use that in DWI convictions. And early on, even for Waco, that was the primary use was for DWI cases. While you were doing the standardized field sobriety testing, you did that at the hood of your car to get it all on video, because if it didn't happen on video, you weren't getting a conviction.
Yeah.
And so that's just sort of proliferated now into all the reasons. And now they still have in-car cameras, but they also have body cameras, and now they're synced together. Then you have cameras in the cars and on the outside of the cars, and now you have,
now everybody has a camera. I mean,
you're gonna get multiple.
The perps
angles.
have a camera.
Absolutely.
The witnesses all have cameras. You're getting all kinds of angles.
And then, we talked about the Texas Tower shooting and the Symbionese Liberation Organization shooting in LA, changing law enforcement. But the other thing that changed law enforcement happened during my career, and that was the February 28, 1997 bank robbery in West Hollywood, Florida, or West Hollywood, California. Before that, all local police, it was pretty rare for local police to carry rifles.
Yeah.
They all had 12-gauge shotguns. It was like the early days, like we talked about. Everybody
had
the 9mm pistol. Had come into favor by then, and a 12-gauge shotgun. And police across the country were starting to get into these shootouts with heavily armed folks. And in that shootout at the Bank of America, the LA officers had to go to a sporting goods store in the block over and get rifles that could penetrate the body armor that the guys were wearing for the bank robbery. And several thousand rounds were exchanged, and you saw a seismic shift across the country to patrol rifle programs, and Waco was no different. Now most officers carry a 223 rifle with them for those kinds of engagements, and there have been engagements here where the bad guys were shooting at the police with rifles, and you do not want to be engaged in a rifle fight with a pistol, or a shotgun. So.
Well, and you talked about a major shift there from revolvers to automatics,
semi-automatics. That was happening in the mid '90s here. There were still officers carrying the 357 revolvers, and back when I started, you still had to qualify with both the auto, semi-auto pistol, and you could carry a backup as a wheel gun, we called them. Yeah. But you had to qualify in both, and I think it was. I was talking to the firearms instructors. It's pretty recent that they just don't get anybody qualifying with a wheel gun anymore. But they're
so talk about that. I mean, what are the advantages from one to the other, or disadvantages too? Even.
Well, the early advantages were articulated as back then, the semi-autos could carry 17 rounds of 9mm ammunition, whereas the wheel guns were carrying 6 rounds, 6 or 8, depending on which caliber. And the ammunition technology back then, there really was a benefit to that 9mm round. Those have been negated nowadays. There's a lot of technology behind ammunition now. And they've actually come back to 9mm. They had moved to 40 caliber and 45 caliber and
10mm.
10mm. And you've seen a shift back to that 9mm, particularly for smaller statured officers. Back when I started, it wasn't uncommon in certainly state police and jurisdictions around the country that if you weren't 6'1" and 200 pounds, you couldn't be a police officer. But now, fortunately, we're a lot smarter than that now, and so we have officers of all statures. But if you have a small hand or a lightweight person, tugging around a metal framed 45 is something to haul around all day. And so, when Glock came out with the polymer framed 9mm pistols, that was sort of a revolution across the country for officers. And it's a tool you have to have on your belt. And so there's, when you start, a lot of officers have lower back issues from wearing that gun belt for what's called a Sam Brown for years and years and years. And if you look at go introduce yourself.
Why is it called a Sam Brown?
I don't know the history there.
I know a guy named Sam Brown here in town. I don't think it would be him.
Not the same guy. I know Sam as well. That gun belt, if you look at smaller statured officers now, they don't have any room left on their belt. Yeah. Right. With all the technology now, they have tasers. Tasers came into being in the early 2000s in Waco, electronic control devices. Usually an expandable baton, an ASP, or a PL-24. They used to carry pepper spray or OC spray on their belt, plus the gun, plus extra ammunition, plus 1 or 2 or 3 sets of handcuffs. Because if you've got to arrest 3 or 4 people and you've only got 1 set, what do you do with the other folks?
And where do you put the brass knuckles now?
The radio, like we talked to, brass knuckles went out in the 60s.
Okay,
no brass knuckles anymore.
Just checking.
Forbidden, actually.
Oh, really?
It's prohibited item. But then you had the radios that had to go on your belt. Well, I remember in the 90s we introduced in-car cameras. Well, now you got to have a microphone pack and a battery pack. Wow. Now you got to have body worn camera on. So all those things take up real estate on your belt, and officers learn pretty quickly you need to shift all that stuff to the front or you'll damage your back. Sitting in a car against those things. So if you talk to any chiropractor in town, they'll tell you one of their better customers are police officers who've had to wear that gun belt for years and years. Some back surgeons will tell you the same thing. That they're good customers are those police officers. But all all that technology now has ended up somewhat miniaturized on their belt instead of necessarily in their car. Now, Waco PD and a lot of other agencies issues a cell phone to every officer that's a computer, so they can do most of their stuff from their cell phone. If you have a Ring camera at home and you need to give the police department footage from that Ring camera, they'll give you a link from their phone to your phone.
Right, it's a smartphone, not the flip up cell phone. It's a smartphone.
I can remember flip phones in police work, but these are smartphones for every officer, and it's a tool of the trade. It's not a luxury.
Mm-hmm.
They have to have that to do their job because of all the interfaces that they have to deal with, all the computer interfaces, and so that's it's really. They carry everything with them, and that car is their office for. I mean, they literally a lot of the times they start at the PD and they end at the PD, but during the shift they shall not see the PD. They do everything from their car, and so those are their offices, and we try to keep that in mind when we're buying cars. We crash ratings on cars we need to take into consideration. We've had a number of cars that are hit at high speed out on the interstate, and some of the cars who are not designed for it will burst into flame. And that's a bad deal if you're sitting in one. And those cars are how they keep traffic off of them when they're out there working those traffic accidents and high speed situations. And so we've had a number of cars hit. We've had a couple of fire trucks hit too. They tend to fare better than police cars do.
A little more mass.
But today's police cars are generally designed specifically to be police cars. Fortunately, are the better ones. Ford are pretty much the folks making the best police cars nowadays.
Everything's in most of them are SUVs.
SUVs. The ones that work the best, they're all-wheel drive. So they're all weather capable. They're big enough for two grown people to sit in the front seat and have
and you're sitting up a little bit higher. You get a little bit better visibility.
Yeah, better visibility going through intersections with your lights on, so people can see you during the day. They're marked in a way that draws attention. Typically, so we had Tahoes for a while. Those were a little more expensive. They're not all-wheel drive. They don't fare as well as the all-wheel drive Fords do in inclement weather.
A little bigger too, probably a little squishier.
And there were some motor issues with the Chevys. The Fords have done well. They're hybrids now, much to gas mileage. When your job is to drive around, you burn a lot of fuel. Because you put a couple hundred miles on a vehicle during a shift, given the 100 plus square miles that the city of Waco covers. It's not unusual to get called way out of your district to another area of town and have to traverse that area. So they can put a lot of miles on those cars, on those trucks. Really, the technology is just, but that's their office. Like the horse was in the late 1800s. Those trucks are their office now, for those patrol officers.
So I have a few questions. I'd probably say almost these may be myths, and I'd like some clarification. And I'll be honest, most of them come from TVs and movies.
Sure. Yeah.
And I know Steven's going to have some too as I start throwing these out. Okay. The car chase where they're just trying to get to the city limits so the police will stop chasing them.
Well, that comes from we talked about it a minute ago, where, back before radios and before the TCIC system and NCIC system, which were the state and national computers, if you could just get outside of the jurisdiction and lose the officers, then you could get away. The other thing that you're starting to see nowadays is that different departments around the country are recognizing that high-speed pursuits for anything other than very serious crimes are just not worth it.
They're dangerous.
And they're very dangerous to innocent bystanders.
Right.
And so a lot of jurisdictions have restricted what the officers can chase for. And not so much now, but in 80s, 90s, some jurisdictions would require their officers to stop at the edge of their jurisdiction. Not so much now. Everybody recognizes the statewide authority of local police officers. You're still a police officer, even if you're in, once you leave the city limits.
Right.
You can't enforce some of the city ordinances outside the city limits, but certainly those felony offenses.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's it's like a lot of other things like that. They're loosely rooted in reality, and there's some truth to them.
Okay. Do you have a myth you want to ask him?
No.
Okay, taser.
I have
Everybody that carries a taser, do you have to get shot with one first?
I wanted to ask about tasers,
absolutely.
but not that question.
We had a training taser where they would put the probes on you, and you would take the 5-second ride, so to speak. And it's a tremendous amount of pain. But the difference in that and the OC spray, I liked the taser pain better than the OC spray pain, because when you turn the taser off, it's done.
Right.
The pain is over. The OC spray, we got sprayed in the academy, and it lasts for hours.
And OC, what's OC stand for?
Oleoresin capsicum.
So is it
pepper spray?
Pepper spray. Yeah.
But it's on a Scoville heat unit, and it's way up on the Scoville heat units. And they sprayed us in the eyes. And the bad news is, when you went home and took a shower that night, it reactivated the OC.
Yeah.
And
Just
so
like don't drink water
dose.
after you eat jalapenos.
Yeah.
You got to drink milk. You should have bathed it in milk.
Yeah, I've been through SWAT training where they put you in tear gas chambers. I've been in tear gas chambers, and that's child's play compared to OC spray.
Wow.
And so
I think I understand the rationale for that, but from a policing perspective, the rationale of putting officers through that.
It's just so you would know the effect. Well, there a couple of things were explained to us, and I've heard it explained. So one is, what the effect is or what it's capable of, and so if you see it not having that effect on a person, that there are other factors at play, like in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, PCP or angel dust would have people on that could have superhuman strength. And so if you see a taser or if you see pepper spray not working like it should, your brain needs to figure out, was that a bad deployment, or is this person going through something different where they're capable of working through those things? So you're probably going to need some more help.
Right.
The other thing is that if the person tries to take that away from you, and if it's used on you, what you've got to work through.
Yeah.
Because in every situation a police officer in, there's a gun. Even if the person committing the offense doesn't have a gun, there's a gun in that situation. And so weapons retention is paramount for the police officer. And so if you allow your pepper spray or your taser to be taken away in a fight, and these fights get very up close and personal, and you allow one of those things to be taken away, how you respond to it. And so if it makes you defenseless, then now you've got to worry about, where is that firearm going?
Yeah.
And so that absolutely has to come into play. Every officer has to know what the effect is on them, and make some choices from there.
Yeah.
Is what that's about. And we've moved into this day and age where everybody's an MMA fighter and everybody's got jujitsu training and all these things. And so
I know Stephen won't stop talking about
his MMA training.
Yeah.
Those interactions are much more dangerous today than they were in the 90s, but just because of the training that regular, residents are getting every day.
So that kind of maybe leads in my next maybe meth question. Every most TV shows or police dramas, you got a partner.
Yeah.
But I don't hear you talking about partners. These are individual police officers in an individual vehicle out on their own.
Yeah. Typically in Waco, they ride one person to a car.
Yeah.
Now most calls are a 2-person call, but there are plenty, a wreck is a 1-person call, what we call a late report call. So if you go home and your house has been broken into, no suspect or anything, that's a 1-person call.
But even if it's 2-person, it's 2 patrol cars.
2 patrol cars.
It's not
in Waco.
Nobody rides together. There's no partner.
Yeah. So some of the specialized
relationship.
units, street crimes, and some of the specialized units, they'll run 2-person cars. Sometimes in Waco, because of overlapping shifts and a small fleet, they'll run 2-person cars sometimes, but typically, if you see a 2-person call, it's either a specialized unit or it's an officer in training. When officers are in their 3 to 4 months of field training, you'll see 2-person cars. You get very close to a person you ride 10 hours a day with.
Yeah.
And so,
Too close sometimes.
yeah, I mean, you really develop some strong bonds. And and policing in Waco is a little different too, in that we have 100 square miles, but if you get into trouble, there's some folks that can come to your aid. There's Waco officers have an emergency button on them they can hit, and it sends a signal back to dispatch. And other officers know that if you've hit that emergency button, things have really gone bad.
Yeah.
And the cavalry's coming.
Yeah.
Everybody
Right.
drops everything they're doing and they're going. Now, we've talked a little bit about before that policing is different in different jurisdictions. Think of a rural sheriff's office in Oklahoma, where they've got one deputy on the road for hundreds of road miles.
Right.
There's no cavalry coming, and so
Yeah.
it's just a different kind of policing. Waco, we're very blessed that it you have partners that you can get to pretty fast, and if you need to, and so but they generally ride one person to a call, but that's about efficiency, right? We talked about earlier, people are your biggest cost, and so if you've got 100,000 calls for service, if you can do them with one officer rather than 2 officers, that's a deployment decision.
Right.
Through the years, when there have been specific threats against police officers, Waco has doubled up some of those years, for some real specific things.
Right.
I remember after 9/11, we went to 100% 2-person cars because we didn't know for several days, was the country under attack? What was going on? But that's always something you can move to.
Right.
But generally,
Right.
they run 1-person cars.
Okay. Great.
Well, Ryan, before we end,
Yeah.
I want to make sure just anything we missed in your research that you got into for this second episode.
Yeah, I think we talked about all the technology and the changes and the things that have helped shape law enforcement now. It's a much different animal than it was in the Old West, fortunately. But that's because the community helps shape their law enforcement, and as the Waco community has changed, so has law enforcement locally. And so it's a product of the local community and the local government and the influence. And so every citizen and every resident gets to have an influence on what kind of law enforcement you get in your community. And so Waco has demanded a certain type of law enforcement, and so that's what they get. And they do that at the voting booth. Even though municipal law enforcement isn't elected, the council members are.
Yeah.
And so the community gets to shape what kind of law enforcement. And I'm really happy to serve in a community like Waco, where there is a good relationship between police and community. And there's a lot of really interesting history that, but man, I'm glad we've changed through the years.
Yeah.
So, but there's a lot of tremendous history out there to be looked at, and I hope that other folks who take an interest in some of this will get into the library and get into Google, and because there's so many of these stories left to be told, and I think there's some screenplays to be written and some
And
books to be
you're on the
written.
hunt too for more artifacts for your museum.
Absolutely. So the museum committee is always looking for specific stories and specific artifacts. Brent Stroman is leading the charge for a public safety museum location. They've been out at a few community events, and so if you find out that your grandfather or your dad or somebody was a Waco police officer, reach out to that committee and work with them. And there's some tremendous artifacts, but we're making police history every day. So there's plenty of opportunity moving forward.
Yeah. Great.
Well, I think you got a screenplay in you. I heard that. Maybe another career, an additional career.
Yeah, there's some local writers. Jody Ginn, who's written some books about the Rangers. He's with the Ranger Museum now, and he and I have talked about some books based on some of the research. But still a lot of research left to be done, and sometimes there's not enough hours in the day.
Yeah.
But just kudos to your group at Baylor for getting this history written down and sometimes recorded, the oral histories, and to document, because there were so many really interesting things that happened here at the crossroads that are Waco, Texas.
Wow.
Thank you.
TM,
Thank you
TM,
for
trademark. Well, thank you, Ryan. I appreciate you coming back. Thank you for your service through the police department and your continued service in all the ways you're serving with the city now. So
thanks for the opportunity.
All right.
Thanks.
Take care.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard, I don't make it by dawn.
Thanks for listening to the Waco History Podcast. Like what you heard? Subscribe, rate, and review our show on iTunes so we can reach more listeners. You can find show notes and info on every episode at wacohistorypodcast.com, and more info on Waco's past at wacohistory.org. Our theme music, used with permission, is Cross the Brazos at Waco, performed by the late Billy Walker. For more info on Billy's music, go to billywalker.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. This has been a Rogue Media Network production.